Today we're going to examine a word that millions of Italians use every day, uccello, meaning bird. But what if everything you've been told about where this word comes from is wrong? The standard story goes like this. Italian uccello comes from Latin aucellus, which was a diminutive form of avis, meaning bird. It's a neat, tidy explanation that fits perfectly with the idea that Italian evolved from Latin. But let's think critically about this for a moment. Latin evolved from something too. What do birds do? They fly. That's their defining characteristic, the thing that separates them from almost every other animal. So when early peoples needed a word for these flying creatures, what would be more natural than to use their word for fly? In Turkish, the word for fly is uc, pronounced uch. Listen to that again. Now listen to uccello, uccello. When we break down uccello, we get uyc, which is the Turkic word for fly plus ello, likely a suffix that was added as the word moved through different languages and regions. Now, this isn't about similar sounds, this is about logical word formation. Birds are essentially things that fly, so it's uc plus a suffix, and that gives us uccello. But wait, you might say, what were Turkic speakers doing influencing Latin? Well, here's what they don't teach you in school. The linguistic landscape of ancient Europe was actually far more complex than the usual Greco-Roman narrative we've all been fed. Turkic peoples had extensive contact with early European populations long before the periods that are traditionally acknowledged by the mainstream academia. The Romans themselves were managing a multilingual empire. They were, pretty strategic about language, adopting and adapting words that would help them communicate with and control diverse populations. If Rome was built on a Proto-Turkic speaking Etrurian territories, borrowing their word for the most visible type of animal flying creatures really makes perfect sense. But this pattern isn't unique. Turkish shows similar conceptual word formation, like with sichan for mouse, where the naming follows the animal's most characteristic behavior or feature. So why hasn't this connection been recognized? Well, it's pretty simple. Academic linguistics is built around a Greco-Roman-centric worldview. Researchers whose entire careers depend on the Greco-Rome-centric narrative aren't exactly going to publish papers that undermine that foundation. Who's really going to risk their tenure, their funding, or even their peer relationships just to suggest that a fundamental assumption might be wrong? But honestly, the evidence is right there in the word itself, uccello, uc plus ello. The Turkic word for fly actually became the Latin and then Italian word for the things that fly. Latin ocellus has that uc word, but their Greco dialect can't pronounce the uc, just as they can't pronounce jarjik. Instead, they pronounce it as tzatziki. It's about recognizing that language contact in ancient Europe was far more extensive and, complex than the official narrative admits. The next time you hear an Italian say uccello, just remember, you're actually hearing an echo of ancient Turkic speakers who looked up at the sky and called those creatures by what they did best. They flew. What if the very foundation of Latin, the language that gave birth to Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, was created by Turkic-speaking peoples? The official story tells us that Latin evolved naturally in ancient Rome. But when we look at the actual history, we see something very different. Latin was a constructed language created for political purposes in a multilingual society. Early Rome wasn't some monolingual Latin-speaking city, it was a melting pot. You had Etruscan speakers, the established power in the region. You had Greek colonies throughout southern Italy, and you had waves of migrants and settlers from across Europe and Asia. Here's what they don't teach you. Latin was literally invented as a compromise language to manage this multilingual chaos. The Romans needed something that could pacify the Greek-speaking populations who refused to learn Etruscan, while also establishing their own linguistic authority. But who were these Romans who created Latin? When we examine Latin vocabulary at its most basic level, the words for fundamental concepts like movement, animals, and actions, we find Turkic roots embedded throughout. Take uccello, which comes from Latin ocellus, but ocellus itself contains uc, the Turkic word for fly. The Latin speakers who coined ocellus were using the Turkic concept, birds are the things that fly. This isn't borrowing. This isn't cultural exchange. This is substrate influence, the foundational layer of thinking that shaped how Latin was constructed from the ground up. The people who systematized Latin, who decided its grammar, who established its core vocabulary, were thinking in Turkic linguistic patterns. They took concepts from their native Turkic understanding and wrapped them in the political and administrative structures that would become the Roman Empire. This explains so much about early Roman history that the traditional narrative struggles with. How did Rome manage to integrate so many different populations so effectively? Because the linguistic architects of Rome were themselves from migrant multilingual backgrounds. Latin wasn't the natural evolution of some pre-existing Italic language. It was a deliberately crafted administrative tool created by Turkic-speaking peoples who had settled in the Italian peninsula and needed a way to govern a multilingual empire. The Uccello to Uccello evolution isn't Latin becoming Italian. It's Turkic concepts surviving through the political language that was built around them. Why hasn't this been recognized? Because acknowledging the Turkic origins of Latin would completely overturn the Greco-Roman foundational narrative that Western academia is built on. Every classics department, every Romance language program, every textbook would need to be reconsidered. But the evidence is embedded in the language itself. When Romans created the word for bird, they reached for the Turkic concept of flying, because that's how their minds worked, that's how they understood the world. Latin wasn't inherited from some mysterious Indo-European past. It was crafted by Proto-Turkic speakers who became the political and linguistic architects of what we call the Roman Empire.